This afternoon's session is going to be devoted to public engagement. And this is a very important topic because if we don't get the public behind what we're doing here, then it isn't going to advance. So we really hope all of you will help us in figuring out ways to advance public engagement throughout our region. And we're very fortunate to have a large group of experts this afternoon. We are not going to take an afternoon break. We're going to go straight through. So we're going to essentially start now, and then we're going to conclude at the end of the day. This is going to be a long panel, so feel free to get up and use the restrooms or get a drink or whatever you need to do during the panel. I'd like to welcome up our panelists, and if they could come up in the following order as I call them, that'd be great, because we're going to have all seats filled starting over here by me. Our first panelist is Kate Rose. Second one is Debra Woithe. Then Regina Bale, then Michael D'Imperio, then Dr. Aaron Adams, and finally Dr. Emily Hall. So if you all wouldn't mind coming up, we'll take a moment here for everyone to be able to get to the front. And I know that a lot of people are going to be filtering in past lunch, so we'll be patient as they all work their way in. Okay, so just to recap, we have Kate here. Then Debra will sit next to Kate, then Regina, then Michael, then Aaron, and then on the far end, Emily. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. Kate Rose has served as the UF IFAS Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent for Charlotte County since January 2022. Kate is a double Gator, earning both her bachelor's and her master's from the University of Florida. She has experience with sponge restoration, disease ecology, finfish aquaculture, and crustacean fisheries, and in her present role focuses on seagrass ecology, water quality, and citizen science. Debra Woithe joined Manatee County in 2021 to further establish the Environmental Lands Program and implement the Conservation and Parks Projects referendum. She works with the County Land Conservation Committee, county staff, and strategic partners to acquire and manage conservation and recreational lands in Manatee County. She's a graduate of University of Florida, earning a BS in landscape ecology, an MS in systems ecology, and a graduate certificate in wetlands. Regina Bale is the environmental education coordinator of the Center for Environment and Society within the Water School at Florida Gulf Coast University. She previously served as an academic coach and teacher in Collier County Public Schools at the elementary and middle school levels. Ms. Bale is currently working on training and curriculum development for K through 12 formal and informal educators to enhance environmental education with technology. Michael D'Imperio is the Water Resources Agent with the University of Florida's IFAS Extension, Sarasota County, undertaking outreach and education work focused on protection, enhancement, and awareness of water quality and water supply to a variety of audiences, including residents, HOAs, youth groups, and local stakeholders. Michael has a professional science master's degree in environmental science from Stockton University, and his background includes work in public water utilities, bivalve aquaculture, and education. Next, we have Dr. Aaron Adams, who received a bachelor's degree from St. Mary's College in Maryland, a master's degree from the College of William and Mary, and a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And he also holds a Coast Guard captain's license. As the Director of Science and Conservation at the Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, Aaron is responsible for formulating and implementing their science and conservation plan, including interactions with resource managers and other non-governmental organizations. Dr. Aaron Adams has been the author or co-author of more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications and has authored 3 books. Next, we have Dr. Emily Hall. She is the Senior Scientist and Program Manager at Mote Marine Laboratory. She currently manages the chemical and physical ecology and the ocean acidification programs at Mote, with labs in Sarasota and in the Florida Keys. Her research is focused on effects of local and global stressors on coastal and marine organisms, specifically corals and harmful algae, and she is the co-coordinator of the Southeast Ocean and Coastal Acidification Network, otherwise known as SOCAN. a network supported by NOAA that focuses on the U.S. Southeast to understand climate changes and the implications of it on coastal resources, helps to inform stakeholders, and to coordinate research efforts. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Kate, and I believe there you go. There's the clicker, so thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jen. I'm going to make a bold move here. As the public engagement panel, I'm going to step out from behind the panel, right? Because we're going to engage the public, particularly after a lunch hour, right, when people are inclined to be a little bit sleepier. So, hello everybody. My name is Kate Rose. I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent for Charlotte County. And today I will be talking about a little citizen science seagrass monitoring program that we run here in the county. So, we've been talking about seagrass all morning, right? We're probably all, at least at some level, aware of the extrinsic and the intrinsic value of seagrass. Do I have a laser pointer? I do. Seagrass sequesters carbon. It improves our water quality. It produces a lot of our commercial fishery and our market value by serving as a nursery. And we're aware of a lot of these interactions and how seagrass creates value for us and our economy. But it's a little bit difficult to quantify exactly what's going on. We know that those interactions are there, but it's hard to assign a value. Further complicating that is the fact that we are losing our seagrasses worldwide at a rate of about 7% per year. We're losing our seagrasses, and you can see here from this graph, the red bars are the amount of sites worldwide that are decreasing in coverage, in seagrass coverage. And of course, Charlotte County and the Caloosahatchee Estuary are not immune to that. We talked a lot about this caulerpa that is in the area that tends to be sort of shading out the seagrass, particularly along the east wall and down in Matlacha Pass. And unfortunately, in Charlotte County, we are blessed with a very motivated citizen group who is willing to help us fill in some of the data gaps that we have when it comes to that algae. So my predecessor, Betty Sogler, got together with some Sea Grant affiliate professors at the University of Florida and came up with methods for seagrass monitoring that our citizen volunteers could perform for us. So we ask that the volunteers form teams of at least 3. We ask them to transport themselves to their own sites, but we do train them on a scientific-based monitoring method, and then we give them the equipment to perform that method. And the data that they're collecting, very similar information to what is gathered by regularly long-established monitoring programs. Depth, sediment type, algae cover, seagrass cover, the seagrass species that are in the area, the canopy height, so the height of those seagrass blades, a Secchi depth, which is a measure of water clarity. And where our methods, the Eyes on Seagrass methods, go a little bit off base is that there's a real focus on that algae component. So we collect information, or our volunteers do, on algae biomass, and we also collect an algae sample. Eyes on Algae is not a sexy name, so we call it Eyes on Seagrass. And so just a little bit of a comparison of the summary of the methods between our program, Eyes on Seagrass, and a really long-established methods that the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves, I know you guys are in the house, that you guys use. This is a brief summary. I want to start with that. So, right off the bat, right? The establishment. Like I said, it's been long established. We have our volunteers use random transects, so we give them a randomly selected point to aim for, and of course there's always a little bit of variability because the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves folks, they have fixed transects. They've got posts in the water, so they know exactly where they're sampling every time they go out. We use a half meter squared quadrat, and the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves folks, they pull out the big guns. They got the big meter by meter quadrat. We have our volunteers sample along a 50-meter quadrat, but the Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves, they sample the whole length of the bed. So they'll start onshore, and they'll finish when the seagrass starts to taper out. And I've heard, just from hearsay, I've heard, upwards of 600 meters, which could be a lot for our volunteers. And then we sample that algae coverage and biomass, and the Aquatic Preserves folks focus on more on that coverage, right? That's where our focus on that algae comes in. There's also a little bit of a time difference here. So because we are focused on algae, we go at different times of year. We go in the spring, which is kind of meant to be when the macroalgae is at its peak as the waters start to warm. And then we also go again in the summer and in July, which is when the macroalgae sort of starts to peak off. Whereas the Department of Environmental Protection and the aquatic preserves, they go sort of in the fall, which is meant to capture the peak of the seagrass. And as a result of this timing and the timing with Hurricane Ian, we had our volunteers were some of the first in the water to conduct a really large scale survey of seagrass since the hurricane, just based on the timing of when these programs run and when the storm hit. So, as the title of this presentation implied, there's a two-prong approach here with the citizen science approach. The first is we are increasing our sampling capacity. We've been sampling 45 sites for 4 years since 2019. That is 2,000 quadrats that have been laid down and surveyed. And there's a value associated with that. Our volunteer time is and our resources and the skills that our volunteer have can be valued at over $110,000, which is no small feat in a room of people who are always looking for money to form their research projects, right? And on top of that, we get data out of it. So before I get too far into the data pattern here, I want to go into a little bit into the color scheme that I used. I know this plot might be slightly dense. So we're looking here at the seagrass coverage in Charlotte Harbor that our volunteers have collected. You can see sort of from this map here, if I get my laser pointer out, that we've got all over the harbor, and we've sort of grouped a lot of our sites into regions. So for those warmer colors are sort of the western side, so the west wall, the Mayaka, and this west side of the piece here. And those cooler colors, the blues, are more along the east wall. And you can see, clearly there's a really seasonal pattern happening, right? This is, we sample in the spring, and then we sample again in the summer, and then in the spring, and the summer. So there's a really seasonal influence, but overall, sort of that downward trend that we were discussing this morning. A little bit less drastic in recent years than it was before. We also sample up in Lemon Bay and just a little bit across the Sarasota County border, even though we are a Charlotte County-based program. And it's a fairly similar pattern that you have going there. Sorry, I'm moving the microphone back and forth a little bit. But in the south of Lemon Bay, you have sort of a more consistent seagrass coverage before you sort of get into that, before we get into more recent times. And in general, though, we're still getting a slight downward trend. Looking at the macroalgae, it's a little bit more complicated, right? It's particularly hard to measure drift algae because it drifts. And so you could sort of see along the east wall, these blue lines, we're starting to get, our volunteers have noticed that algae seems to be sort of ticking down a little bit in past years, but on the west wall, it seems to be increasing. And then, come 2022, it gets a little wonky, because that was when Ian hit. And there has been a little bit of evidence that that acroalgae was maybe blown out by all of that water that came through, buried up. There seems to be a little bit less of it now going on in the harbor. Lemon Bay, kind of the opposite. It seems as though those seasonal patterns got more distinct, and there actually seems to be a little bit of an uptick in algae in Lemon Bay. So, our second prong. Of course, our volunteers are more than just a source of labor, right? They end up becoming advocates for this habitat. So a survey of our 2022 volunteers, we had an N of 23, a 35% response rate, which might not sound like a lot to all the real hard scientists in the room, but that's really exciting for us social scientists. And we saw in that survey a 28% increase in knowledge gain from our volunteers in seagrass biology and ecology issues, as well as threats to the system. 91% of them, 6 months after that, or 3 months after that July sampling, 6 months after the April sampling, reported that they had actually taken additional action to preserve this behavior, right? So some of them took efforts to reduce prop scars because they knew that that was a concern. Some of them advocated in a more traditional sense. You know, they went and they talked to their politicians about why this habitat was important to them. A fair amount of them also just taught others and spoke to others about why this was an important endeavor. And 82% of our volunteers were willing to get in the water immediately following Hurricane Ian for an additional sample to evaluate how the seagrass was doing. Ultimately, we decided not to go that route because we didn't think it was particularly safe, but that's a huge amount of people, right? Especially when we didn't know what was going on. Pretty impressive, I think. So where do we go from here? So right now, I have been working with existing programs in this region. We have our program, of course. The Sarasota Bay Estuary program also uses these methods. And the Tampa Bay Estuary program uses a little more in-depth methods because they're using scientists and professionals to gather their data. But we have all started talking to each other to find ways that we can connect and sort of develop synergies, which means that a really large portion of the Southwest Gulf is being covered in some way, shape, or form, whether or not it's by scientists or by citizen scientists. But we want to continue to expand. So right now, we actually, there's an Eyes on Seagrass program running up in the Panhandle. There's some interest in the Indian River Lagoon, particularly in that aspect of increasing sampling capacity, right? So they've lost a lot of seagrass over there. They're looking at restoration efforts. And when you can maybe leverage citizen scientists to monitor seagrass after it's been restored, that's a huge cost savings. We also have Sea Grant agents in other areas of the state, of the Big Bend, and the agent in Miami-Dade County is interested in implementing a similar program. And the goal, right, is so that we would like to be able to expand this statewide so that we could have a data set that is comparative across the whole state, but also allows local flexibility and engagement. So I spent a very long time, we have as a whole for this whole, during the Watershed Summit thus far, talking a lot about algae. That's not really an issue for the program up in the Panhandle. So rather than collecting additional information on algae, they collect information on water quality. And with that, I guess I'm not going to be taking any questions at the moment, but I absolutely have to thank our Eyes on Seagrass volunteers, some of whom are here today, and also make a shameless plug. Our summer sampling hasn't started yet. So if you are interested, you could scan this QR code to our website, and there's additional information as well as registration information, but I will also be around if you are interested in participating soon or maybe next spring. Thank you, guys. Oh, we have our own microphones. I'm going to turn mine off.
We do. And I too want to stand, but I'd actually like to use the microphone that is in place so I don't have to worry about holding it the right distance from my mouth. All right, so how's that? Well, good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here today because I love my job. I get to spend taxpayers' money buying conservation land. So it comes with its challenges for sure. And I got to figure out how to use this clicker. Here we go. Other way.
Oh, here, no, flip your...
I was upside down.
There you go.
Okay. All right. And so, yes, I am here this afternoon because of a 2020 Conservation and Parks Projects referendum. In 2020, 72% of the voters in Manatee County agreed to tax themselves 0.15 mil and up to $50 million in bond, should it be approved by the commission, in order to buy conservation land. There was a specific language in that ballot. I'm not going to read it to you, but it is there. And that, of course, was important for me to keep in mind as I was going about implementing this program because that's what the voters read and that's what they agreed to. This wasn't initiated by the county. It was a grassroots effort. There were a lot of people that were involved. Trust for Public Land did the surveys, the polls to see what the level of support was like. A lot of different grassroots groups and individuals worked really hard to make this happen. So if any of you were working on that or voted for it, thank you. So in going about the implementation of it, really the foundation is an ordinance that Manatee County's had in place since about the 1990s. It's the Environmental Lands Management and Acquisition Ordinance, or Committee. LMAC is how we refer to it. It's been updated over the years. It's currently at 17 members within the committee, and those members are appointed by the commission. Within the last 2 years, the commission decided that they each wanted to be able to appoint one member from their district, so it increased so that's 7. The remainder have backgrounds in environmental science, real estate, finance, et cetera, things that are relevant to land acquisition. The ordinance speaks specifically to ensuring that public participation is part of the decision-making. And as somewhat of a side note, the LMAC also serves as the tree advisory board for the commission. So their job is to make recommendations, not to make decisions, but the process, the criteria, and the committee were already established in this ordinance. So we're working with it. Of course, the transparency, accountability, and oversight are important, when you're working with taxpayer money. I take that very seriously. And already built into the process is having this appointed advisory board review and make recommendations. And their recommendations go to the commission. Ultimately, our county commission has to decide on which lands that we're going to buy. But all those stakeholders, their understanding of what we're doing, the support that I hope to gain from them is very important. So I needed a tool. We needed a tool to be able to communicate this. And when I started in 2021, I was a one-person division. And so I didn't have a lot of staff to support all of this. Took me ahead a little bit. So on the bottom left, there's a diagram that describes the process. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through it step by step, but it does start on the left-hand side with nominating. And from our environmental lands program webpage, there's a nomination form. Anyone can nominate a property. Then it goes to staff review. We do a desktop review looking at all the various GIS data and remote information that gives us an idea of the natural resource value. And if it's in the higher rankings, 3s and 4s versus 1s and 2s, then we contact the landowner, see if they're willing, because first and foremost, it's a willing seller program. And if they're interested, we schedule a site visit, we go out, we see the land, we find out what's most important to them as a landowner. What are their goals? What are their needs? What's their timeline? Do some ground truthing and learn more about the resources that are on site. And then we take the property to LMAC. LMAC reviews it. To date, they've reviewed over 80 properties, maybe close to 90. Actually, over 80 have been nominated. And 15 to 20 have risen to the top and been presented by staff to our LMAC. And of those, about 8 have gone forward as recommendations for conservation acquisition to our commission. And there were 3 properties that didn't pass the commission muster, that they didn't choose to support us on at the time. But we do have 5 that we're working on right now, and a 6 probably in the near future. So these criteria I wanted to touch on. From the LMAC ordinance from 2003, there were 4 main criteria, and these are pretty fundamental to conservation lands, across the country, probably across the world. The ecological quality of the species or habitat, the rarity of the species or habitat, how connected those lands are to other conservation lands or natural connections, and also the importance to water resources. And the map on the bottom right is actually from a project that I did over 20 years ago when I was working for URS for Manatee County. And that the project was to take those 4 criteria and existing data and model countywide in order to prioritize land for conservation acquisition. So at that time, they didn't have a regular funding support. There have been some great parks that have been added to Manatee County since then. But then fast forward 20 years later, and we have this referendum that now supports the acquisition. And the specific things that were called out in that referendum, we have drinking water protection, water quality protection, preventing stormwater runoff and pollution, preservation of fish habitat, preservation of wildlife habitat, and provision of parks. So they are essentially considered in those four main criteria that we had been using for so long, but we call them out and address them specifically so that we know we're meeting the expectations of the voters and those who pay taxes. So of course, when you're buying conservation land, other things come into play as well. Unfortunately, or not, maybe not even unfortunately, but it's not all science. And so rather worrying about splitting hairs over, a 3.8 or a 3.7 rank property, as far as the scoring goes, we have things like partnerships with other organizations, because a lot of our funding that can make our tax dollars go farther are, coming from other conservation organizations, Florida Forever, Southwest Florida Water Management District, and others. And actually on our map that you can see on our webpage, that you'll hear a lot more about, in that dark green are our existing conservation lands, including easements and conservation of any type. And I have these dashes that go one direction for Florida Forever proposed properties, and dashes that go the other direction for Swiftmud proposed properties. So if you see a crosshatch, that means it's a target land for conservation acquisition for both. And we look strategically across our county to see who our best partners are on different properties. And each property is somewhat unique, almost like your children. They have different needs and different ways of accomplishing their needs. So with owner discounts, that's something that is important to discuss with each of these property owners, because if they were to donate the land or to sell the land to the county for less than the appraised value, that difference is considered a charitable contribution by the IRS if those criteria are met. So that can be a benefit to them as well. And conservation easements is something that we consider as well, because that is a way of conserving land and preventing it from being developed. All right, so in having this means to communicate with the public, with our committees, our decision makers, even internally as staff, and having a tool to review all these properties, I needed something. And not having a staff that I could rely on to support these efforts, I turned to our IT group and our GIS groups and asked them if they could develop a tool using ESRI software, their dashboard software, and a bunch of data sources that we already had in-house, and amazingly they did. Within a few weeks to a few months, we had something functional. We're now working on version 2, so if you were to look at it this week or next week, it'll look a little different from what you're seeing on your screens, because we have improved a few things. In the top right corner, you'll see these sort of orange circles, because I'm a gator too. And so top right, you have a pick list of all of our candidate properties. So those are ones with willing sellers. You won't see on these web pages anything that doesn't have a willing seller. We don't talk about buying people's property at a public meeting until we know they're interested. And we don't want them to have our intentions taken the wrong way, that the government's gonna try to buy their land or take their land. So on the bottom, there are a few tabs. We have information about the project, status, the type of acquisition, public access types, partners, historical and cultural resources, and other notes. You see a big number right there, 90. It's a 90-acre property. The 0 in the bottom left tells us that none of the property is improved. So there's $0 in this case that would be spent on improvements. No homes, no businesses, things like that. And we also have a tab sort of in the center, the bottom, that identifies the yeses or nos for whether they meet those ballot criteria. And the other tab down there is the rankings 1 through 4 for those 4 LMAC criteria. And on the right, my favorite part, because it's colorful, and as someone who's used GIS since for a long time. I love maps and I love colors. So it's an at-a-glance indicator. Each of those bars are layers from the Florida Forever Conservation Needs Assessment. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have a lot of other organizations looking at conservation value. So relying on that, picking the layers from those studies that are most relevant to our habitats in Manatee County. There are ecological greenways, functional wetlands, floodplain, rare species habitat, strategic habitat conservation areas, and also underrepresented natural communities. And so, the beauty about this product, this dashboard online, is that myself or other staff with the password, we just go into this little lookup table, we enter the parcel numbers for the properties that are in a project, and then magically overnight with the scripts that they've written, and it gets executed and is refreshed every day. And so all this stuff is reported to us and to everyone so that you can see it as our projects are changing in status and new projects are nominated and decisions are made by our advisory board and our commission. So just this slide is just showing a couple of different of the features. And actually I chose, each of these slides shows a different property that's being considered. And if I have time, I'll go back through those. I think I've been talking more than I had expected, so I'm gonna skip that for the moment. We also have in this lower tab, reference documents, or what's called. So we have photographs that we take on site. If you see one here, you click on it, it pops out. You can see what's actually on site from our site visit. This particular view is from a boardwalk in Perico Preserve, and it shows the property that's nominated for acquisition. And so you can imagine if we didn't buy it for conservation and the property owner chose to build on it, it would really make a difference in that view shed. We also have a filter on the left side. If you wanted to search for candidate properties according to acquisition type, you can select, is it a conservation easement? Is it fee simple? And also a filter for property size. So, if we're just looking for the properties that are over 100 acres, et cetera, you can select that way and have those results reported back to you. You can pop the map out and do a lot of exploring. You're probably all familiar, with how online mapping works. Zooming in and out, selecting the layers. We have over 20 different layers relevant to conservation prioritization that are included here. You can turn them on and off. We have a 1940s aerial photograph here. And that pop out at the bottom, this is an interesting property. We're referring to it as Gospel Crusade. And it started off as one property, and now it's actually 4 that form several hundred acres with several different access points and recreation opportunities. Originally, it was part of a church, and they used it as a retreat, a Christian retreat, but also the camps and the trails for practicing for missions. Very interesting property. And so that map was from the 60s. So an example of a couple of the layers we have hydric soils. We're also adding in scrub soils. So very quickly and easily, we can get familiar with a lot of the different characteristics of our properties, and so can everyone else. So if there's any input, any engagement, we have, we're gonna develop this into a hub so that there's an online way for public to provide input, but our contact information is also there. So anyone looking at this can provide their feedback to us. In the bottom right are the land use land cover categories, and you can hover and get measurements as well. So for instance, this property is one that's on the Manatee River, and I'll give a little credit here to the Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast. I know they're all here today. One of our very important partners in conservation acquisition, and they have been working with the owner and brought this property to the county. And one of the things that not-for-profit partners can do for us, of course, with county, we have that process we have to follow, and we have limits on how we can spend money. And private organizations like theirs can often be a little more creative and act a little faster. And so they can secure a property, bridge funding, and there's a number of different things that they can partner with us on to help us make sure that our common objectives are accomplished. Even though we have different funding sources and things that we do separately, it's great to be able to work together. So as far as accountability and oversight, I mentioned that's, I think, an important part of using the public tax dollars and gaining support for what we're doing and how we're doing it. So we have an annual report that we've committed to. It'll be on the website. We'll have a couple performance measures for our success in terms of the acreages of habitat that are acquired, how many of the referendum goals are met, and what the criteria, what the rankings are for the parcels that are acquired, as well as financial reporting. We have a number of people that are engaged with us in this that will not let me forget about any one of these things. They will all be reported and reviewed. So we'll have updates on our web pages. How am I doing on time? How much? I lost track. I have like a couple more minutes? Okay, all right. So you probably want to hear a little bit about the properties that we're considering for acquisition. So I'll back up and, all right, so one of them is, it's part of Tercea Aquatic Preserve. It's just south of Seaport Manatee, 90 acres. It is currently undeveloped. It goes along the west side of the railroad track there, and it's been farmed historically. There are a lot of natives that have grown up in there. There are some exotics. And it's part of the optimal boundary for the Tercea State Park. So, we've talked with the state park, and while Manatee County has a really strong resource management group that could manage it, it makes a lot more sense for that to be managed by the state park because they're managing everything around it, next to it, I should say, not around it. And this is a property that has been on the Florida Forever list and also on the SwiftMed list for conservation for years. And so we're working with them for funding. And it may be that the state buys this with Florida Forever funds and that the state park manages it in perpetuity, and that Manatee County steps out of the process at that point and we don't do anything else. And if all I do is introduce a buyer and a seller to each other and something that results in success, then that makes me happy. I think that would make everyone happy. This is a more recent project we started working on. The conservation land you see to the west, this is on Sneed Island in Manatee County. It's Emerson Preserve. Manatee River is on the south side. Tercea Aquatic Preserve is on the north, and it tips out to Tampa Bay. So there are, I think, 600 or 700 acres currently in conservation for Emerson. It's a state acquisition, county management, and this additional 97 acres could have the same arrangement where we have state dollars that help to buy it. We've been talking with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program about the possibility of using grant funding from them to do some restoration because, I guess the screen doesn't show it, but there is a lot of that property that is improved pasture. So there could be some great tidal restoration, allow for some resilience of communities there, expand the park, provide more access. And so that's a second that we're working on. And we're referring to this one as the Emerson Addition, I think. So a third is Perico Bayou. This is really more, I would consider it an out parcel. It's surrounded by Perico Preserve, and it's a private landholding that's left sort of in the center there. And if they were to build on the very small part of upland, they would require from the county an easement that goes right through the preserve to get there. So we would much prefer to have that as part of the preserve than have a road go through the preserve and have a home built there, of course. We're working on the appraisal for that one, and hopefully this one could close before the end of the year, possibly. This property, in looking at it, you can see the land covers, you've got some tree crops and some open lands, and then some residential and commercial property. The Mix and Fruit Farm, if you're from the area, particularly Manatee County, you're probably familiar with it. A lot of people grew up going on field trips, going to visit. They have the wildlife, and you may be thinking, why would you buy that? There's no natural resource value there. There's no native habitat there. And so this one would be a water quality improvement project, so funds for restoration. Thank you. All right.
Hello. Hi, I'm Regina Bale, and I'm with Florida Gulf Coast University, and let's see if we can start clicking. Clicking, clicking, clicking. Nothing's changing. Good luck for me. I'm going to start bebopping my way through it. So hello, I'm Regina from Florida Gulf Coast University. And real quick, hands up, folks who are aware of, went to, alumni of, work at FGCU. Hey, look. Ah, yeah. So I'm the Environmental Education Coordinator at the Water School. I work for the Center for Environment and Society. So what is really cool about that is that the Water School is this new interdisciplinary concept of bringing together multiple departments, a lot of different people who work on their common thread, which is water. So if you're thinking geology and earth sciences, you're thinking marine systems, you're thinking environment, boom, all together and perfect, ready to go. Where I fit into that is I am an education person. My studies are in the learning sciences, and I spent my entire career doing curriculum and instruction. What ended up happening is that they have these activities that they need to get out into the world of K-12 that have to do with the chemistry of the water, that have to do with these massive amounts of data. And how do we actually do that? That's where I kind of come in as the conduit to get those things together. And there we go. So the first thing you'll want to do, we can go back a slide, there is a QR code there. That QR code is going to allow you to see this presentation up close on your device. Why you actually want to do that? Number one, so you keep our contact information and become best friends. Like, definitely, yeah. But two, in the presentation, we actually have links to our own data dashboards. So yeah, high five on GIS and Esri. Look at that. We connect so nicely. I love it. But that way you can actually use our dashboards. There are links to it so that you can connect. So I introduced myself. I got to introduce my buddy too, Drew. He is our GIS analyst extraordinaire at the Water School. And so I knew nothing about GIS. I didn't know what it was. I was like, is that GPS? Excuse me. But no, it's GIS. And we were able to work on this project together to kind of get things going. So let's get started. Let me get caught back up with where I left off. All right, so first we're going to take a little bit of a dive into how we use geographic information system at the university already, not in our K-12 sphere. So it's used with faculty, staff, and students at the Water School. And GIS is extensively used in different projects. GIS and these geospatial techniques can be used in a wide variety of applications. And our GIS technology and mapping are used to understand our oyster reefs and do oyster reef mapping, which is really cool, actually. How many people have visited the new Water School building, AB9? Anybody? Yeah. Oh, we have a few. Some did the tour. You know, I'll hook you up with a tour if you need to, but you should come check out some of the cool stuff that's going on there. So, students are able to work on these GIS projects and use this GIS technology in performing real-world experiences in class and working on a final project that involves an environmental real-world problem they have to solve. So our university undergrads are doing a lot of cool things with GIS. Another neat connection that we have is with our service learning and civic engagement section of the university. At our university, every single student has to get service learning hours. So they're always looking for projects that are meaningful for what they're doing. It's not just, I'm going to volunteer 2 hours at this one place and add some hours together, but to do an actual project. So some of the cool projects that have been done are with community partners, and they do these real-world projects related to GIS technology in an efficient manner. For example, creating a tree inventory for the Naples Zoo. So you can actually see on the slide we have a few different community partners and a lot more that have given us projects to use like their GIS data and to do analysis or provide them with dashboards or story maps. So a lot of cool things going on. So I was at an event and I bumped into Drew, and he was telling me about this map about propeller scars and seagrass. And he showed me this story map, and that's kind of what started my thought process on, oh, this is such an easy way to communicate this information. This is a great way that we could bring this to K-12. So Here is our project. It's called Trees, Teaching Resiliency Through Environmental Education in Schoolyards. So what we're looking at is resiliency in the concept of mitigation and adaptation. Now this is a big concept to bring into K-12, especially since I'm doing some of this with first graders and I tested it. It totally worked. It was amazing, but it took a lot of thinking to figure out how to do it. But the great thing about it is that we are working directly with teachers so that they can adjust their current curricula, what they're already doing, and bring in these concepts. It's going through several phases, though. This is a very long-term project, and we're at the beginning stages. So the Trees curriculum supports K-12 schools, and currently we are working in 2 school districts. But Florida Gulf Coast University's service area is a 5-county district, 5 counties of Southwest Florida. So currently we have Lee and Collier, but we're looking for Glades, Charlotte, and Hendry. So if you know anybody, we'd like to be able to help you guys out with getting that curriculum going. So the phases of how this is going to work. So in instructional design, as we're looking at programs and how to put them together, we usually use the ADDIE model. So first we do our analysis, like what is the situation, what are the learning needs? Then we move into the design development phases, then into our implementation and our evaluation. So starting with our needs assessment, because my job is to get the water school research techniques and tools out into K-12. That's not necessarily anybody else's goal. So we had to meet with the school districts to find out what exactly are the issues, what are the things that you actually need. And some of the cool things that we found out during the needs assessment is that math and science is hard to teach, and a lot of students have trouble with it in those younger grades. Well, guess what? It's fun to go outside. It is really fun to go outside. Guess what's outside? Math and science. Don't tell anyone. But it's amazing. So it's a lot of thinking outside the box once we got the needs assessment done, looking at test scores, about working with data. Starting in 3rd grade, students are given assessments where they have to work with quite large data sets that are very abstract or representational, and they have no concrete background on what's going on. That's what we need to provide. So what we started doing is looking at what we could actually bring to the table that would make the school districts want to work with us on these projects, because environmental education is not something that's tested. It's not something that's like, an important subject when you're thinking about whether or not your school's getting funded and if you have enough teachers. So what we ended up doing is talking about, we have education expertise, we have science expertise in our water school, and we have research happening right now. We keep growing. We have so many, there's some amazing faculty and staff in this room right now, by the way, so if you see them, high five. But they're doing really cool stuff. It's just like the rest of you in this room, all that data that you're collecting, all these cool patterns that you're finding, these epic fish, those need to get out into the world. This is how we can do it. So that's what we can bring to the table, is all those cool things. Next is our shared vision. So we had to develop together what we're actually looking for. What would be the results of this partnership, doing this trees thing together? And so what we decided upon is that all students will spend more time in their schoolyard. They will be outside more often, which is like one of the goals of the center that I work at, is getting people outside and with nature. The next is that students will benefit from a sense of place and doing data collection and analysis and an understanding for their local environment. I nicknamed this at the beginning, before it had a name, parking lot science, because every teacher told me, well, I have a parking lot, I have this random patch of grass, can you send us on a field trip? I'm like, no, your watershed is everywhere, and the way we have manipulated it and adjusted it is part of that learning, so you can do that in your schoolyard as well. Then the last one that we talked about was that teachers and students be able to develop projects based on these experiences related to their local watershed and their local resiliency issues. So in thinking about that, they need to be empowered to be able to go out, collect data, store it, analyze it in some capacity, and then do something with it, which is kind of the same process that we use in teaching. I'm going to show you this skill, I'm going to give you this information, we're going to process it, we're going to figure it out together, and then we're going to do something with it. So This fits very nicely together, and our meetings went really well. Lee and Collier County is like, this sounds awesome. And I'm like, I know. And then they're like, let's do this now. And I'm like, I'm one person. So we have to find a way to develop this so that each member of that district, each teacher themselves is empowered to do it. So we focus mainly on teacher training and being able to give them the tools that they need. So the first thing we needed to do in phase 1 is have a shared tool. And this is where that GIS component comes in. Because what matters when you're using GIS? Where you are. Where do I want them to be? In the schoolyard. So what do? We require that you're doing something outside, your data collection is outside, and so that you would go out and you would use. And so what we use at the university is ArcGIS Online from Esri. Yeah, lovely dashboards, by the way. I was like, oh yeah, it's like, we'll have dashboards too, it's so cute. But what ends up happening is that because we use that, it's much easier to train them on it. And what's really nice about Esri actually is that the school districts can sign up for free accounts. I know. So all Lee and Collier County, every student, every teacher right now has a free account for the same software we use at the university. Kind of amazing. Esri loves educators, by the way. That's just a high five out there. But once we got everyone on board with the shared tool, which took a while to get through all of the hoops of getting a new technology added to something, it helped that it was free, but still, it took several months. We're now in the early adoption phase, and in the early adoption phase, and forgive the typo, the early adoption phase has us working with like specific cohorts of teachers. How did we find them? I just hit the ground running. I went to every STEM event, environment event, Earth Day, whatever I could get to, and any district event that they let me into, I showed up with a table and I said, look how easy this is to do. And then I, had random kids do it. I did public events where I was like, how old are you? What? Come here. Do this. And it's like, Mom, give me your phone. They instantly could collect data for me, so we knew it would work. We got those early adopters going. We just finished up a summer program. It was an entire day training for about 15 teachers in Collier County schools. They came in with a lesson plan they already use, a lesson they teach every year. And it was from 2nd grade to high school. And every single person left with the tools they need to develop a survey 123, so a digital survey that would be on your phone or a device that they could use at that lesson. So for an example, you go outside on a kindergarten nature walk and you do your 5 senses. Every time you stop with the teacher and you go, oh, I found something. He's like, what sense did you use? I used my eyesight. Okay, what did you see? I saw that blue carpet right there. Well, let's put a data point in to our cell phone here, and boom. When they come back to class, it's gonna be on a map, on a dashboard, ready for them to review all the things that they saw. And if we get enough people using the same ones over and over again, they're gonna be able to compare that to the other classes in the school. They can compare it to the rest of the county. It's a really cool thing. So we had a few people do water quality ones, because that was the one I did as my example one, which is pH of water. In pretty much any body of water you find at your school, from the puddles that develop to just the different reservoirs that are outside of almost every school we have here in Florida. It's set up so that whatever you have outside, whatever lesson you already teach, we GISify it, and you go outside and you collect that data. Once they have the data, they can then analyze it together as a group in the classroom. So it's like real and relevant. So if I bring you back maybe to like your old middle school days or anything like that, you would usually learn pH, like here's a lab, here's like 4 clear mystery liquids, test them with the strips, and then we'll see what number we got, and we're done. But this could be, every quarter we could go out, or after every rainstorm, see how the water has changed at the pond. That fits like 8 different standards in those grade levels. So it gives a teacher a million reasons to do it. So those activities were really well received from our first few cohorts that have gone through. Now, next, our biggest partners, Lee and Collier County Public Schools. And on this slide, if you do have it on your phone, you can click on the icons for the links to the different school districts to learn more about them. But in here, this is one of the first teacher trainings where we tested this idea for about 2 hours. where I was like, okay, we're gonna give them a pre-built lesson that I've already made, that already has the GIS components in it, about surface temperature. And so they just went out into the university and they just started collecting surface temperature data all around. If you look at the little cell phone image, that's how simple the survey is. You can make them very plain and simple, so it's like a question or two, or you can make them incredibly complex, which is why it works great for K-12. You could adjust it as needed for your grade level and your audience. When they were done, they had that beautiful, dashboard developed, and I want to say that's next, the beautiful dashboards. So here are 2 example dashboards of things we pre-developed for teachers. So they could look at it and they could see, all right, this is the final product. This is what I'm making and how they could use it in their classroom. So the one on the top is the one from that day. I actually did 2 teacher trainings on that. We did the first one, Drew and I were doing that one back at FGCU. The second one, I went to East Naples Middle School for a bunch of science teachers, and I was like, you wanna try it? And this is what was developed. Everything on there is dynamic, so as you click and move through things, you zoom in and zoom out, then all of the, those data representations change. Multiple standards and things that students need to be able to do is not only read and analyze and understand those, but develop them themselves. This gives them the model of how to start. The bottom one's a really cool one. We actually lost a field trip location after the hurricane, so it was like, what are we gonna do? We're gonna pick a new one. So I was out with a group of teachers in Lee County who were prepping for using Manatee Park as a new field trip location because the beach was unusable at the time. So this is a dashboard I used with those teachers. I set up a survey for 3rd and 4th grade. So in 3rd and 4th grade, only thing that you really need to know in this one standard is, can you identify plants and animals? And then of plants, which ones are flowering, non-flowering, and of animals, which ones are vertebrate, invertebrate. So we were able to go through on our kayaks up and down the river, and we were able to put in all these data points. I found this, and this is where I found it at. That way we could go back, and after we were done kayaking and we had lunch, I pulled up my laptop and I was like, okay, here's the data dashboard. And immediately every teacher who was there with me was like, wow, you know how fast we could have conversations about this? You know how easily a student could visualize now what is going on, which is just a great option for them. So working with ArcGIS Online and the trainings, we're going through teaching them how to develop surveys, how to make maps, how to build dashboards, and eventually making story maps so they can share that information. So, fun fact about the next steps, because the goal here is that whatever your section of the watershed is, that schoolyard, that may be the only time you get outside. It all depends on, what your life is like. If you're a student and all you see is that schoolyard, that's fine, we could still learn in it. We need to get them outside as much as possible. We need as much buy-in as possible. So we also need the support. So for the continued teacher trainings and support early in Collier County, that's what I do. I go out and do those teacher trainings. They're super fun. And I get a lot of service learning students who help me write some of the curriculum. So we have some examples to show them. We need to do more outreach in further parts of our service area. So hopefully, because I'm a little further north today, somebody knows somebody and we'll all hang out. But that way we can kind of spread the program, because it's less of, here's a lesson I want you to do, here's just something in a box that you need to get done. It's more of, let me empower this teacher so that they can continue using this again and again, meet their standards, meet their deadlines, help their students, but then also actually get across these really important things that they need to know that aren't usually going to be discussed much in school. And then the expansion of trees development teams. So I am going to be hopefully pulling on some more members so we can keep developing more things in coordination with the College of Education and with the Water School, and then developing more partnerships around the region. So if you have massive data sets of really interesting things, if you have really cool images of the stuff that you're finding, if you have any kind of cool science that you want to be able to share with students, especially their local watershed, I want to get that into their schools, so we can definitely partner up and work on that. But the overarching thing about this, about trees, is we're not going to get to that resiliency mindset until we start at the basics. And the basics is that data. How do you understand it? How do you know how it's collected? If you don't know that, you're going to go through all of K-12, and you're going to go into adulthood, and you're still not going to get it. And then when you get all of this information now, it's just overwhelming and scary, and you're like, I have more important things. I have bills. I have other stuff to do. But if this is like, a long-term kind of solution, if we go throughout school, and this is a focus where we can still get everything else done that we have to, but there's always this moment of, this is our watershed, this is your schoolyard, this is where you live, it's going to make it more impactful as they grow up, as they become voters, and as they kind of change things for the future. So once again, children are the future and all that good stuff. So thank you for listening. That was trees, and I'm gonna wrap it up now on time. Yeah, I was worried.
Hi, my name is Mike D'Ampirio, and I'm with the UF IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. And today we're going to be looking at some of the learning outcomes from our water quality and biodiversity lab as part of our Life or Learning in Florida's Environment program. So not with me today, but also on the Life team from the Sarasota County Extension Office is Dr. Catherine Clements, Sarah Davis, and Jackie Leibowitz, who are all very heavily involved in creating this program. So if anyone's unfamiliar at this point, Extension is a partnership between our land-grant university, which is the University of Florida, and each individual county throughout the state. So traditionally, the land-grant universities were tasked with education around agriculture and scientific research. As we've evolved, we have found the need to disseminate this information to the general public. So the land-grant universities have partnered with each individual county in order to get this directly to the community. Learning in Florida's Environment, or the LIFE program, is coming up on 20 years old. It was originally started in 2004 in Apalachicola and was originally a partnership between Franklin County Schools and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. It's been adopted in Sarasota County and is now being run through the Sarasota County Extension Office as a partnership between UF IFAS and Florida State Parks, Sarasota County Parks, and Sarasota County Schools. We take children from middle schools in the area and we bring them to 3 different distinct habitat types. And each habitat type will have its own suite of different labs that are meant to be interactive for the children to work their way through not only concepts in the hard sciences, but also to be introduced to some potential career opportunities and life skills. So for our water quality and biodiversity lab, we were at Oscar Scheer State Park. So we had our lab with the backdrop of Lake Osprey and Oscar Scheer, which was a great opportunity for the kids to get involved with the water and have some hands-on experience. On the slide are some different pictures of some other opportunities that we took the children on throughout the LIFE program. These are pictures from Oscar Scheer, Lemon Bay, and Mayaka State Park. This is largely an initiative through 4-H. And if you've never heard of Extension, odds are that you have at least heard of 4-H. 4-H is Extension's youth development and education initiative. And 4-H really prides itself on having a learning by doing approach, really striving for that hands-on learning experience. So youth are always given the opportunity to develop life skills, acquire knowledge, and form attitudes that help them to be more productive members of society as they come into age. And of course, everything that we do really does have a focus of career development in mind. So throughout life, we took students and they had a chance to engage in thoughtful play as biologists, limnologists, entomologists, and horticulturalists. Everything that we did was based on state educational standards. So the labs were thoughtfully developed to be in line with state standards to incentivize the teachers to take advantage of this program. This program is available to all of the local middle schools, but we paid particular emphasis on bringing this opportunity to Tier 1 schools. We really wanted to provide this opportunity to traditionally underserved communities to really introduce these children to that career development aspect and to show them what is out there as far as careers in the natural sciences. In order to do that, we made a hands-on learning experience where they were actually able to be the scientists for the day, and the kids have a blast doing that. If you tell a kid that he can be a scientist for the day, and you give him or her some instruments to go out, measure the water, and report their findings, they are in another world. So we did this across 3 key ecosystems: freshwater, uplands, and coastal. And actually, funny enough, the Water Quality and Biodiversity Lab is part of our uplands module. So the students did an in-class preparation to start off the lesson, and then they would go out into the field to see what they learned in real life. Our Water Quality and Biodiversity Lab introduced kids to, you guessed it, water quality and biodiversity. So the students would learn about a couple different water quality parameters and why they're important when we're looking at the health of an aquatic ecosystem. They were also introduced to the types of instruments that are commonly employed in the field to measure these parameters. So we were introducing kids to the types of instruments like pH probes, dissolved oxygen meters, thermometers, and even dip nets and some macroinvertebrate collection techniques. And this was meant to, again, expand those pathways of future careers. This was meant to show them that there are things that are outside of the box that you can be when you grow up. And it provided a great hands-on experience for all the 4th and 5th graders. We set this up initially in the classroom where Dr. Clements would come in and introduce the topics. She would go over basic information and really give them a rundown of what they could expect once they got out in the real world. After that, the field lessons took place at Lake Osprey and Oscar Scheer State Park. And when we arrived for the day started by dip netting some macroinvertebrates from the lake before the students arrived. We kept the macroinvertebrates in plastic bins in the shade and covered and out of the view of the students to surprise them at the end of the lesson. As the students came over to where we were having the lesson, they were split up into 3 different groups, and these were going to be their working groups for the day. Each group was assigned a different water quality parameter that they were going to be focusing on for the lesson. One at a time, one group would come approach and be the group of focus, while the other 2 groups would stay in the back and listen and learn along with us. The main group that would come up would be given their parameter and given the instruments that they needed to test that parameter in water that was collected from the lake. So for instance, we started with pH, and the students were given a pH probe that they could hold and play with and manipulate and get a feel for the settings and how to actually use this out in the field as if they were studying the water in real life. As they were given the turns to go around and test the water, we would have a group discussion about why pH is important in the aquatic environment and what could potentially happen when pH may be out of range and what that may signify and some different effects that might have on the macroinvertebrate community. We then repeated that for our 2 other water quality parameters, which were temperature and dissolved oxygen. So each group would come up, and as they were getting a turn to use the instrumentation, we would have a facilitated group discussion about why that water quality parameter is so important. After we had all 3 groups come up, use the equipment, and talk a bit about what we were learning, everybody went back to their tables, and we had a group discussion about how water quality may affect your findings of biodiversity. We had some thoughtful discussions about why different water quality parameters may either be of benefit or detriment to the amount of macroinvertebrates that we could expect to find. We then asked the students to work in their groups and develop a hypothesis about what level of biodiversity they would expect to find if they were dip netting in the lake based off of what they learned about the water quality parameters. The point of this was to get them out of just looking at numbers and start to manipulate the way that they're looking at that to be more of a critical thinking attitude. So connecting those numbers to how they can actually experience that change in real life. So we had a thoughtful discussion about the hypothesis, and then each kid got to be a little bit more of a scientist, and we got to the best part of the day, which was bringing out the bins of macroinvertebrates. And the kids really loved that. We would take the lids off the bins, get a countdown, and then they would have the chance to dig into the bins, get up close, and look at all the critters that we collected during the day. There was a lot of things in there, and to them, everything was a surprise. Most of the kids never saw things like freshwater shrimp or dragonfly nymphs before, and it was completely new for them. Some of the kids were actually pretty scared of some things in the bins. We had some fishing spiders, which were always a little scary for the kids, but that's another learning opportunity for them to sort of get outside of their fear. These are some of the lessons that were brought into the classroom to set them up for the field version of the lab. So we would introduce them to different water quality parameters, and we would also start to get them thinking about what biodiversity means. So we would use some visual aids to demonstrate biodiversity and help them think along what they could expect to see out in the field. We also gave them an introduction as to the different pieces of equipment they could expect to use. So unfortunately, they did not have the opportunity to actually get to dip net, and that was only because of time constraints. So we did pay particular attention to introducing the topic to them and letting them know exactly how the macroinvertebrates were collected. But they did get to use the pH and temperature probe and a dissolved oxygen meter out in the field. These are the data sheets that the children would use to collect their findings. The first side of the sheet is just to write down the numbers. In each group, there was a student that was tasked with being the special data collector for the day, so everybody had a role throughout the experiment. And the other side is a visual aid to help them collect their data about the biodiversity. We broke them up into pretty broad groups of macroinvertebrates just because we weren't looking to get too specific with the kids. We were mostly just looking to introduce them to the general concepts. As I mentioned, the students were asked to develop a hypothesis, and this was also on the first data sheet. They were asked to circle if they could find either a high or a low expected biodiversity in the lake. And a bit surprisingly, every single group hypothesized that they would find a high level of biodiversity. And this is what we found based on every single lab. So they were really able to take what they learned about the water quality parameters, internalize that information, and then take it a step further and think about what that meant for the ecology of the site. And they were able to come up with a hypothesis, and they were able to give answers and justify why they thought that that would be the case. Then they were given the opportunity to look at the animals and prove themselves right. So we set the bar a little bit low for high level of biodiversity, but that's intentional. That's a two-part intentional decision because we were looking at the broad categories of macroinvertebrates, but this is also meant to be encouraging for the kids. It's almost designed so that they would be right once they got in and looked at the level of biodiversity, because we really want to show them that they can do this role when they get older. It's really meant to introduce them to careers and instill a bit of confidence. So for some outcomes, we reached 249 fourth and fifth graders through the Uplands Life module. So that's nearly 250 students that made their way through the water quality and biodiversity lab, and each field trip was 3 hours. So in addition to the water quality and biodiversity lab at Oscar Scheer, students were also given a tour of the scrub environment for a conversation about animal adaptations in a fire-dependent habitat. And they were also given an opportunity to be horticulturalists and botanists and learn all about plant reproduction. But I want to focus on the outcomes of the water quality and biodiversity lab. So when looking at the knowledge gain related to being able to define and talk about biodiversity, we showed that there was a 30% knowledge gain among students. It probably could have been a little bit higher, but when you look at the numbers, it looks like there was already pretty high level of knowledge about being able to define biodiversity. We just increased from a 70% score on a pre-test to a 91% score at the end. When looking at the students' ability to talk about acids and bases and identify different items on the pH scale, we saw a 74% knowledge gain. And then when we talked about the effects of temperature on dissolved oxygen in the aquatic environment, we were able to demonstrate a 106% knowledge gain. And to me, the most important outcome is the number of first-time life experiences that we were able to provide. So of the 249 students, 72% of them reported being at Oscar Scheer State Park for the first time. That's nearly 180 children that were being introduced to a state park in their own backyards for the first time. And not only being there, but getting to be part of the state park in a way that they normally would not have the opportunity to do. We also noted that there was very similar knowledge gain between the 4th and 5th grade students. So this model of education is very scalable to the level of grade that you are working with. The take-home message is that we were not only to show knowledge gain, but we were able to demonstrate that this method was really valuable in being able to develop critical thinking skills, really taking what they learned about the numbers and turning that into critical thinking about its effects on the environment. We introduced new career opportunities that would otherwise be out of view for some students. And as I mentioned, we paid particular interest in focusing on Title I schools. 72% of the students had a new life experience, and students, of course, enjoyed themselves and had fun in an educational outdoor environment. So that's kind of it for today, and we will save questions for the end.
I'm also going to switch over to the podium so I can see the timer there. So when she gives me the hook, I'll know when to leave. Yes, I'm Aaron Adams. I'm the Director of Science and Conservation for Bonefish Tarpon Trust. Prior to that, I actually lived on Pond Island for 12, 13 years, working for Mote Marine Lab. We had a Charlotte Harbor field station way back when. Charlie caused a lot of damage and kind of went somewhat downhill from there. So I'm going to talk a lot about some of the work that we did back during that time, talk a lot about public engagement, but also bring in a different topic that I think is super important. How many people in the audience have, we'll call it a marine or estuarine or water focus in their education? Okay, that's the vast majority, which you'd expect. How many people have taken a graduate level course in terrestrial conservation biology? Okay, a few. And how many have taken a course in undergraduate terrestrial conservation biology? Okay, a few more. And that's where I'm going with this. In the marine world, estuarine world, we are many decades behind our terrestrial colleagues in conservation. And there's a lot of information I've already heard this morning that in a terrestrial setting would have already been integrated into a comprehensive approach on Charlotte Harbor conservation and management. So we've got all the information here. We just don't have the structure to do it because we don't have enough terrestrial conservation biologists in the mix. And I got exposed to terrestrial conservation biology when I was doing my PhD at University of Massachusetts in Boston, which has a fantastic terrestrial conservation program. And as a marine scientist for decades prior to that, learning what they do and putting it into the type of work that I now do was fantastic. So I encourage, if you have not taken a terrestrial conservation biology course, find one, even if it's online, and take it. It'll open your mind to a lot more ways that we can use our information. So I'm going to start with some basics here so we're all on the same page. This seems self-evident, but you'll see later why I bring it up. So the amount of habitat influences fish population size, right? Pretty basic. But habitat quality influences their health, survival, and abundance of fish, which obviously affects population size. This is a picture of the same seagrass bed before and after harmful algal bloom, blue-green algae. Water quality is an important component of habitat quality for fish. I'd say it's the most important habitat, but you never hear water quality talked about as fish habitat, right? Again, because we're not thinking big picture like our terrestrial conservation colleagues. That's one of the red tides from, 2018, with all the freshwater flows that came out, Caloosahatchee. And habitat connectivity influences fish health, survival, and abundance. This is a natural mangrove creek, and this is a water control structure that dominates Florida, how we manage our water. People think about salmonids, trout, et cetera, migrating up and downstream as far as part of their life cycle. A lot of the fish in our world do the same thing, snook being one of them, tarpon another, which you heard about this morning. They need that kind of connectivity. So every time we put up a structure that limits connectivity, we're basically creating a fragmented habitat which decreases biodiversity as well as the abundance of fish that we care about. So we're already in a habitat deficit. Florida's already lost 50% of mangroves, over 2 million acres of seagrass, and that's growing. I'm now located in Indian River Lagoon, and we essentially have no seagrass. I can pull my skiff 8-9 miles and not see a blade of seagrass. It's much worse than the data that you see. Florida's also lost about 44% of the wetlands. And look at other states, that's some of the highest proportions in the United States. So all that I just told you about, fish require healthy and abundant and quality and connected habitats. They're already at a deficit as we think about how we're going to keep our fish abundance and diversity high. Water quality is also a big issue, which we heard about this morning. But I want to emphasize that even if you have completely pristine fresh water coming into an estuary, if you affect the timing, the amount, and the quantity, and location, that should be location at the other one, you are going to cause changes in estuarine ecology. Well documented by a lot of research from around the world. So even if we didn't have water quality issues, just the way we've changed how water goes into estuaries is a huge problem. The Florida Bay situation right now, you can take out the water quality issues. That's mostly about the timing, the amount, and the location of where that water comes in. And so that's what a lot of Everglades restoration is about, is restoring that. Increase in nutrients, as we talked about this morning, a big concern from a habitat component is they cause harmful algal blooms or enhance them in the case of red tide. On the East Coast, the question came up this morning about red tide. The FWC monitors for red tide in the Indian River Lagoon, but it really doesn't occur there. Our biggest problem is brown tide, but we also get a lot of cyanobacteria now, which is causing a lot of human health issues also. I should also emphasize the photo I have there is on purpose. That is a pipe coming off of Route 1 in Indian River Lagoon with no filtration whatsoever. So there's no stormwater management at all along, 30, 40 miles of IRL in that county. Contaminants are a growing issue. PFAS everybody knows about, a lot of metals, pesticides, herbicides. We recently did some research for bonefish and redfish, bonefish in the Florida Keys, redfish around the state, and every single fish had pharmaceuticals in its tissue. Okay, that's coming from our wastewater infrastructure. Our wastewater plants do not remove contaminants, much less pharmaceuticals, from the effluent. And Florida has, nationwide, has 20% of septic systems for the entire nation are here in Florida. Charlotte Harbor has, in their watershed, has a lot. Indian River Lagoon has a lot as well. And all that is basically untreated with those contaminants coming out. So that's the basics on habitat water quality. Now I'm using snook as the example, again, thinking about the terrestrial approach. So I'll make sure everybody's up to speed on the basics of snook life history. In general, they spawn near inlets on an ebbing or dropping tide at dusk during summer. So right now, we're actually having dropping tides on this new moon. If you go out to, say, Captiva Pass, Boca Grande, you're going to find a spawning snook this evening. Once they broadcast spawn, the eggs hatch in about a day. The larvae ride the currents up into the estuary over about 18-day pelagic larval duration. And they settle into creeks and wetlands. Some of the arrows show some of the examples there, some of the same places that Matt talked about this morning, and Kelly as well. And you can see some early snook there starting to look like their parents. The juveniles stay in mangrove wetlands and creeks for the first 2 years on average, sometimes longer. In general, when they leave earlier, their survival isn't so high. And I've circled some of the hot spots for the juvenile habitats. So one of the things that we did many years ago, and there's some in the audience who were part of those projects, is we created basically toll booth systems for the creeks. We built antenna. We put pit tags, RFID tags in the fish. They're the same thing as the mobile pass that you put on your car and drive through the toll booth. And so we could get an idea of how fish were moving in and out of the creeks. And what we found, there's some nice looking creeks in the upper part of the harbor, is that 1-year-old snook, not many of them left the creeks during the summer, late spring and early summer. And of those that did leave, a good portion of them didn't come back. And our hypothesis there is that because they're small enough, not wise enough, that a lot of them got eaten. You look at 2-year-old fish, over about 35% of them emigrated 2 years after they actually came in as larvae, late spring, early summer, same time period, but they had a very high return rate. So basically what this means is that when those larvae come into a creek system, that's their spot for the next 2 years. So if we alter those habitats, we're impacting not just the habitats themselves, but the portion of the snook population, the juveniles, that are going to then feed the adult population in future years. It's not like they'll say, oh, this is a really terrible place. They'll pick up, leave, go somewhere else. That's it. And so those are irreversible changes. So we looked at the effect of water flow alterations, again, reflecting some of the stuff that was talked about this morning, on snook diet, right, which affects their growth, survival, those types of things. On the north, you can see a couple small creeks that have what you would call mostly natural watersheds, relatively speaking. On the bottom, those of you who are familiar with the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative, that's the watershed we're talking about, much larger and highly altered flows. So what we found is that when we pump stomachs of fish, of juvenile snook, we found big differences. In the low impact creeks, in other words, our water flow patterns were the same as they were, say, 50, 60 years ago versus the others, which were very flashy flows. Think of mini Caloosahatchee rivers, that type of flow regime. You can see that 35 to 41% of the snook stomachs were full. In the degraded creeks, it was considerably lower, right? So they're working hard for less food. But it gets worse, because you look at diet diversity in the less degraded creeks, you can see on average 16, 19 different prey items that different fish would eat, which allowed those fish to specialize in different portions of the different, all the different prey species. So some ate a lot of shrimp and just a few fish, others ate a lot of, say, rainwater killifish and just a few shrimp. So you could fit more fish into that area and they could all do well. In contrast, the degraded creeks, much lower diversity of their diet. So they're working harder for less fish and competing more for those fewer prey items, which means slower growth rates, lower survival, and a smaller snook population coming out of those creeks. And again, once you have those changes, unless you do major restoration projects, which you'll hear about tomorrow morning, those are permanent, irreversible changes. Okay, so I've talked about habitat and effects of water quality, et cetera, on fish. Now I'm going to talk about how we manage our fisheries. And you're not going to hear me use the word habitat or water quality until I say what's missing. So for snook, it's very tightly regulated. About half the year is closed to harvest. Very small slot limit. Basically, you can only keep fish within a few inches of total length. It's 98, actually 99% now catch and release because of these regulations. And FWC estimates that the spawning stock is steady. But if you talk to fishing guides and anglers from throughout the state, there's disagreement on that. And the big problem is that recruitment is declining. In other words, recruitment means those small little larvae coming into and then those creeks and then growing up to contribute to the fishery. And the top culprit is habitat loss and degradation. This image is an aerial image of the exact same spot from 1951 and today, right? That's irreversible habitat loss. And earlier there was talk about watershed dynamics. There's a perfect example. We're not even into the estuary. We're in the watershed and at some of those creeks. But the only response that FWC has is to restrict and reduce harvest, because they look at the number of fish. They're not at all working at all in the habitats, which is unfortunate. And so I'm going to go back a little bit of history lesson. 1958, and you can read that as I talk through, Marshall, who was a biologist for the state at the time, doing work on snook, basically said it's a habitat issue. It's not a fishing harvest issue. And that's about the time they switched from allowing snook to be commercially harvested to no commercial harvest. This is 1958. Right now, there are 21 million people in the state. In 1958, how many million people were here? 6 million, right? They had a lot of habitat compared to what we have now. And again, in 1985, Brugger and Haddad, and Ken Haddad became executive director of FWC. They said the same thing. You can't manage fish unless you manage the habitat that the fish depend on. FWC, unfortunately, and no other management agency in the United States, much less the world, manages habitat for marine fisheries management because we're not taking clues from our terrestrial biologist counterparts. So, the current status of fishery management, this is how we manage it. Fish stocks, talk about jurisdictional boundaries, harvest, how many die if you let them go, how much fishing effort there is, how the fish grow, how they reproduce, how many they reproduce, those types of things. There's nothing in there about all the things I just spent the last 8 minutes or so talking about, is all the fish habitats. There's also something else missing, and this comes to the public engagement part, is the fishermen, the anglers. They have a lot of economic value, which I'll get to in a minute. There's a huge cultural value in a place like Florida, right? A large portion of the people move here from elsewhere to fish, or they grew up here fishing. There's a lot of what we call local ecological knowledge. A fishing guide who's on the water 300 days a year for the past 30 years has a lot of information up here. And we're not using that information nearly as much as we should. Education and engagement is a big part. A lot of times we collect data from fishermen, we don't give it back. Right? How many people in here are professional fishing guides? Not a hand went up. That's a problem. They should be here too. So they learn what we are learning. And they can be great partners in advocacy, which is what I'm going to get to now, or in a moment. I have to have this. Kind of a kick is we are following what we call an incrementalist model. We, instead of having big changes because we know we haven't been doing it right for the past 120 years of fisheries management, we're doing little steps. And in today's world of rapid change, that's not adequate. Incrementalism is not going to cut it. Imagine if you tried incrementalism to invent something like Facebook or Instagram or all those. It wouldn't cut it. So we need a paradigm shift. And that's why I'm standing up here talking over and over again about terrestrial conservation biology. Everybody should go home this weekend and read about terrestrial conservation biology. It'll bring you up to speed on exactly what I'm talking about. So following that and winding up here, we propose that juvenile snook can be an umbrella species. How many people have heard this term umbrella species? Okay, a handful. And there's your definition right there from way back in 1997. How many marine fish species are being used as umbrella species right now? Great answer, 0. And that's 1997 when the terrestrial people started to define it. But we would say that juvenile snook could be, right? If you protect the juvenile habitats, the habitats used by juvenile snook, you also protect 55 native species. Things like mollies there and killifish and mummychugs, those types of things, which will not get any conservation attention from resource managers because how much interest can they get from policymakers for a fish this big? You know, little killifish. They won't. But they will get it for snook because they're worth a lot of money, and I'm going to get to that as well. So if you take Charlotte Harbor, and this is work that we did with some FWC colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, if you look at juvenile snook occurrence in creeks in Charlotte Harbor, you take that dashed blue line, you get a high number of juvenile snook in samples. So from that line south in the harbor, just about Alligator Creek, you could identify all those creeks as juvenile snook habitats and use juvenile snook as an umbrella species to protect the habitats for broad biodiversity conservation. Very pretty basic. It seems like that's what they've been doing in terrestrial conservation since like 1952 or something like that. We could do a lot better. How many people here know Reed Noss or have heard of Reed? Okay, if you haven't heard of Reed Noss, he's at the University of Florida, an epic terrestrial conservation biologist. Go back and write down Reed Noss. Go back and read some of his stuff over the past 30 years or so, and it'll help out a lot explaining some of the stuff I'm talking about. We also think that snook can be a flagship species, right? Everybody knows what a flagship species, because World Wildlife Fund has done a fantastic job of finding cute, cuddly things like pandas or charismatic things like gorillas or elephants to raise awareness, right? It's like, why should some kid in the suburbs of Cleveland give a damn about conservation in Africa because he thinks that elephants are super cool? We could be doing that here with a slightly different twist on it. That's because Florida markets itself as the fishing capital of the world, And that's because just the saltwater recreational fishery is worth over $11 billion a year, right? That's larger than agriculture in the state, but it's not getting its fair shake in estuarine and marine conservation. If you look at snook, it's a popular charismatic species. It fulfills the flagship species definition. Those are just a handful of magazine covers that have snook on them. And they're big part of that $11 billion fishery. Anywhere in Florida that they occur, and now with climate change, they are in every single county in Florida, just about, people fish for them. People buy boats, spend a lot of money fishing for snook. So we are getting to the point now with our education, because we've been working with the fishing community for quite some time, to get them up to speed. Again, we don't just collect information, and my colleague Joellen Wilson will talk about this tomorrow morning. We also give that information back to them. And so we now know that a lot of the anglers in the state of Florida, whether for snook or other species, consider habitat and water quality as the most important issues. For example, in 2016 at the Florida Snook Symposium, which the FWC has every 5 years, the top angler concern was juvenile habitats. Think about that. It wasn't harvesting more fish or having a longer open season. It was juvenile habitats, and that's the fishermen. So the final slide here is we can engage a very large portion of our community, the recreational fishermen, to get them involved in the process, which is a public engagement, stakeholder engagement. We can use a habitat-based approach that is informed by terrestrial conservation. And that's an example of one of the recent articles that we've put out collectively with FWC. Right, so it's public engagement, yes, but it's also taking that perspective from, if you've been in terrestrial conservation biology, they've been doing stakeholder engagement for 100 and some years, and we're just getting there. So that's kind of suggestions for us moving forward. Thanks.
Hang in there, guys. Last talk of the day. So let me see. Whoops. Okay. So thanks for having me. I am Emily Hall, and I am based at Mote Marine Laboratory in Sarasota, Florida. But today, I'm actually here representing the Southeast and Gulf of Mexico coastal acidification networks, SOCAN and GCAN, and I'll describe those in a second. But the work I'm going to be sharing with you is the work that we've been doing with these groups called the Coastal Acidification Network Stakeholder Feedback Project. Normally we have acronyms for everything. I don't know why we didn't do one for that. But we are primarily funded through the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program and the Integrated Observing System Regional Partners, or the IUSs, in the Southeast and the Gulf of Mexico regions. And this is a project that we've been working on for the last year in partnership with CHNEP, where we created a stakeholder feedback survey about ocean and coastal acidification and where and how we should be focusing efforts on these stressors. We've presented it to a number of stakeholders throughout our two regions, where here I'll be showing you some of the results of that. And so, as I mentioned in the opening slide, I am here representing SOCAN and GCAN, and we are two of the 6 coastal acidification networks, or CANs, throughout the U.S. And these were established, again, by the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, which isn't that old of a program, but we are all around the U.S. The Southeast, the SOCAN includes North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, including the Florida Keys, and GCAN covers Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, the Florida Gulf Coast, and that's where we overlap. And they are also recently, within the last year, including Cuba and Mexico as well. And so SOCAN and GCAN are comprised of executive teams. For SOCAN, that's myself. I'm the co-coordinator of SOCAN, along with my partner up at University of Delaware, Dr. Janet Raymer. And then for GCAN, it's run by Jennifer Vreeland, who's also out of GCUS. And then our working groups, we have working groups that are made up of researchers, resource managers, communication specialists, and educators, along with cultural groups. Our mission is to work directly with those groups and policymakers to synthesize and communicate the state of ocean and coastal acidification science and to meet regional community needs. So today I'll begin with a very brief primer on ocean and coastal acidification, especially I wasn't sure how many people in here had been to some of our previous meetings this year. And then I'm going to focus mostly in the Gulf of Mexico, since that's where we're based today. So the first thing to understand is, what is acidification? And I'm so pleased to hear that all of these education programs are starting with pH. But it is a chemical or water quality problem. Acidification in water can be caused by many things, like addition of acids, like acid rain to freshwater ecosystems, or addition of carbon dioxide. Or you can even get temporary acidification, and I believe this happened when I first joined the world of the working community. In the Alfire River, I believe there was an acid spill from the power plant there. So you can get temporary acidification in an aquatic environment from things like that. So this acidification lowers the pH, though it might still be within a basic range, as you'll see on the scale here. However, the lower the number, the more acidic. Many of us understand pH when measuring the chemistry of our pools, our fish tanks, or even within our bodies. But the acidification that we focus on is caused by an increase of carbon dioxide to seawater that causes a pH decrease that can be harmful to biota. Although it is important to note that not all low pH conditions are necessarily harmful. Different biota have different thresholds of what they can tolerate. And the other thing to point out, I was mentioning on the scale here how we may not actually be in the acid category. So seawater, average seawater pH is currently around an 8.1 or an 8.0. And so even dropping to something like an 7.9, 7.8, you're still in the basic side, but you are more acidic. It's also important to note that estuaries fluctuate more than the open ocean pH levels, but this means that even small tenths of a decimal change can have large impacts on animals and plants. We can make high-quality pH measurements of free-floating hydrogen ions in water, but we can also directly measure some other biogeochemical parameters that help us understand the drivers of acidification, such as alkalinity, total dissolved inorganic carbon, and CO2 concentrations. And then we can calculate using the rest of the biogeochemical parameters of the carbonate chemistry using those parameters. There are also multiple ways for us to measure these parameters, including underway on research vessels, instruments on fixed platforms, such as on piers. There's a really great example of one in Tampa Bay right now that's been running for a number of years. It's called the LoboViz through USGS, and the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, I believe, is supporting that as well. Or just discrete measurements. And so then what is ocean acidification? And so if you haven't heard of ocean acidification, I'm sure that you've heard of climate change. And ocean acidification is considered the other CO2 problem, or the evil twin of climate change. Ocean acidification is specifically due to atmospheric carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuel that is dissolved directly into the surface of the ocean. And like our bodies, nature likes to maintain a balance as best as it can. So the ocean naturally absorbs about 30% of the CO2 that goes into our atmosphere, which is great. It's taking greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere. However, because we are burning more fossil fuels at a faster rate, directly related to our exponential increase in population, we are shifting the chemistry of our oceans. It is important to note that we are generally referring to the open ocean again, I want to make that point, compared to the continental shelf or coastal zone waters. In the graph here on the right, you can see that since the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing by an average of about 2 parts per million per year. And it has also been increasing about that much in our global surface ocean. On the left, we can see that as carbon dioxide dissolves into the surface ocean, it reacts with water to ultimately form an acid, and those free hydrogen ions that we can measure. This causes pH to decrease. And the excess CO2 does affect the type of carbon in seawater that plants and animals use to grow. And so it's also important to note that acidification not only affects those species, but habitats and ecosystems as well. On the bottom here, the small shell photographs, you can see images from an experiment that exposed small marine snails to high CO2 and low pH water for about 45 days. And so by day 45, the shell has clearly dissolved. It almost looks like a melted wax version of itself. Which means that organisms, small organisms like this, or even in juvenile stages, can't survive or won't grow to become successful adults. So then there's also coastal acidification. So let's make it even more complicated. Coastal acidification does include that ocean acidification, the absorption of the CO2 in the water, but it's also driven by local and regional processes, such as eutrophication, where excessive nutrient input that causes increased algae or bacteria, when those die and decay, they can release more CO2 into the environment. Upwelling and transport of acidified waters, we see a lot of that in the Pacific Northwest and off the coast of California. Freshwater inflow from rivers or groundwater that have lower pH and higher CO2, and runoff from storms or agriculture, runoff due to impervious surfaces, septic leaching, other point sources, all of those contribute to excess nutrients that lead to eutrophication. However, adequate resource management can mitigate decreasing pH. If we can control point source output, regulate fertilizers, and manage stormwater, we can mitigate acidification and the negative impacts to the environment. And so here's quickly what we know about the Gulf of Mexico, acidification in the Gulf of Mexico. Long-term Gulf-wide monitoring is still too young to give us information on decadal trends as we have for the atmosphere, but we do have some knowledge of known and potential unknown drivers that may affect acidification. Some of the known drivers include warming, air-sea carbon dioxide exchange, circulation like within the loop current, river input storm events such as hurricanes, eutrophication and hypoxia, and submarine groundwater discharge. Unknowns include coastal inundation or flooding events, oil seeps, and spills. We also know that the main cause of acidification, or CO2, is increasing in Gulf of Mexico waters. Low pH is also known to occur during and following hypoxic events driven by things like harmful algal bloom die-offs. Also, pH can be variable on spatial scales as small as across bays and estuaries. For example, there can be differences between areas with a lot of seagrass beds, sorry, on the other coast of Florida where there are no seagrass beds, but at the mouth of an estuary or even where freshwater is entering an estuary, you can get major differences. And so, again, more on what we know in the Gulf of Mexico, this is a visualization of what we know about biological impacts. We have three general classifications. We have economically important species, species that have been studied in the lab, and species that we know have been impacted by acidification in the wild. And as you can see, there's actually very little overlap here. We don't really have any information yet on how acidification impacts wild stocks, but we do know that in laboratory studies of shellfish, shell formation is negatively impacted, and that early life stages of shellfish and even some finfish do not survive if the pH is too low. We've done a lot of work. I didn't even bring up coral here, but if you want to talk to me about coral, that's my world down in the Florida Keys where I can talk about a lot of stuff, a lot of acidification impacts to our corals, which is even more depressing. And so as for social vulnerability, in 2019, there were almost 200,000 jobs reported that depended on commercial and recreational fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, which accounted for over $7 billion of employment wages and gross sales of almost $32 billion. And this is just fishing. So it doesn't account for other recreational activities or the intrinsic value of ecosystems or the services they provide. Local economies stand to be impacted by losses in the fishing industry, and we just don't know how much yet. And so there are many gaps in our knowledge of where acidification is occurring and how local economies will be impacted. And so we reached out to you guys, we asked you, our stakeholders, to help us figure out where and how to prioritize funding to gain more knowledge. And this is especially important, and this is going to take us into the results of the stakeholder survey, but it's important because in 2009, the United States Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification, or the IWGOA, was formed as part of federal legislation. Then, in March of 2021, as part of a second federal act, the IWGOA started working on a national economic and environmental vulnerability assessment, specifically asking for inputs from the CANs, from those coastal acidification networks. The vulnerability assessment requires input from the stakeholders, which we initially did through workshops with our general membership, but to expand on that feedback that we had already gotten, SOCAN and GCAN partnered, along, again, with the assistance of CHNEP, and were awarded a small pot of funding to develop and implement a stakeholder feedback questionnaire based on methodology after the CHNEP climate change vulnerability that is on the CHNEP website. The goal of this project has been to gauge stakeholder perception of acidification, to identify locations where acidification monitoring is needed, to provide information on stakeholders' monitoring priorities to policymakers and government funding agencies. And so after identifying these gaps that are important to stakeholders, the goal is to inform the next IWGOA report, which will go to the White House, which will hopefully be part of another federal act. So jumping into the results. We presented the survey in 2 different manners. You guys have all been doing Mentimeter today, and so that's how we did the first set of surveys, where we met at in-person meetings. We initially tried to reach out to all of the NEP Technical Advisory Committee meetings and the Citizen Advisory Committee meetings. Remember, again, this is all throughout the Gulf of Mexico and up the coast up to North Carolina, so that was a lot of groups to try to reach. We also had an online Google form that we sent out via email and posted on our SOCAN and GCAN websites. Unfortunately, we didn't get as many responses as we had hoped for, but and that is one of the problems of trying to do these things and lessons that we're learning as we move forward. So you can see the majority of the responses were through Mentimeter, and that means that was when we were in person or on Zoom, but when we were actively sitting here saying, answer these questions for us. Also, when you look at the graph on the right up there, you can see the majority of our answers came from Florida. And that's probably because most of our in-person meetings were throughout the state of Florida. Florida had the biggest response to us, that were like, yes, we want you to come talk to us. We also were able to do one in North Carolina, and then all of those orange bars were just from our Google form. So just going quickly through the questions, the first one we wanted to know is, do you have any knowledge on this topic prior to today? If so, how would you classify your level of knowledge on ocean acidification? And the majority of the answers were some knowledge, not a lot, not a little, some, kind of right in between. And we kind of expected that. The second was, how would you describe your main source for information about acidification? And the main answer was school, and schools, sorry, words. The next one in there was other, then print media, and you can see there were some other answers down. Peer review literature was one of the least amounts, it's really interesting to think about that, because as researchers, that's where we put a lot of our effort into getting that message across. So there needs to be better effort, to put into some of these other ways of getting information out. Which of the following processes are you familiar with? And again, our answers that we had on here were based on the original assessments that the IWGOA did. And so the number one answer was nutrient contamination and eutrophication, and I wasn't surprised with that, our regions being throughout the Gulf of Mexico and up the coast of North Carolina. Second was stormwater runoff, and then erosion and runoff. And then we asked, of the following processes, what do we think could lead to or worsen acidification? And the number one answer, again, was nutrient contamination and eutrophication. And then stormwater runoff, freshwater, and interestingly, fossil fuel burning was much further down. So that's good. We're starting to get some information out about coastal acidification and what's happening more locally. Are you concerned with the effect acidification will have on the environment? Overwhelmingly, yes, which was really great. We had one no. It was somebody from, not to call them out, but I'm going to call them out, from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program Technical Advisory Committee that said no. So no idea who it was, but somebody said no. Well, that's okay. If you are concerned about the effects of acidification on the environment, please rank the ecosystems, and that should say of concern to you. And the number one was estuaries, bays, and lagoons. Again, not surprising, since that's where people live, and where most of our people spend their time when they're near the water. Are you aware of the potential effects of coastal or ocean acidification on marine animals? And again, the majority was yes. So slightly less than that -1 that we had with worrying about ocean acidification. But that's okay. That's a good sign that people are aware. Of the marine animals that may be affected, which are you most concerned about? The overwhelmingly number one answer was coral. And again, I think that might have a little bit of to do with bias, as coral is in the media a lot, especially in the state of Florida. There's a lot about talk about coral restoration, and there's already a lot of talk about how they're going to be impacted by acidification. That's one of the number one species that we've done most of our research on to date. And then following that, it was oysters. And other was number 3, but it does include crabs, everything else, all species, coccolithophores, pteropods, phytoplankton, shorebirds. Do you fish recreationally or commercially for finfish or shellfish? Basically, how many people were fisher people in our group? And we got about half. Half of the people that we surveyed said yes, they fish. but 100% were recreational. And that comes to the point that Aaron was making, is we didn't have a single commercial fisherman, take this poll. And I agree that we need to figure out how to reach out to those communities a little bit better. If yes, which zone best describes your fishing grounds? The number one answer was inshore, bays, and estuaries. If these ecosystems are affected by acidification, which in your opinion is most important to focus on, this was almost a tie between inshore bays and estuaries and nearshore coastal waters. I'm not sure why it didn't follow the same path as the one before, but pretty close. What describes the top 3 types of seafood or fish that you consume at home? The overwhelming answer was shrimp, 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 shrimp. So we like a lot of shrimp. There were a lot of other answers on there, but that was the number one answer that came back. There have been very few studies on the effects of acidification on shrimp. So interesting. What recreational marine activities do you take part in? I was also surprised about this one. The number one answer was scuba diving. I thought it would be, since we are at Florida, especially the number one state. What did you say it was, Aaron? The fishing capital of the US? Yeah, but fishing was not the number one activity that the people that we surveyed took place. It wasn't even number 2, it was number 5. Are you concerned that acidification may affect your employment in the future? High majority said no. So only about a quarter said yes. I'm wondering if those were ocean acidification scientists. The following locations could be affected by acidification. Rank your concern about the potential effects. The number one was, again, shallow coral reef ecosystem. So we definitely are seeing that, the coral reef impact and the public perception of it. So rank aspects of acidification research that you think should be prioritized. The number one answer was impacts to habitats. So we've kind of seen that theme a little bit about here, like habitat restoration, studying habitats, how to do all that. That is a big concern, at least in our region, and that's good to see, and it's good to see that people still think even acidification in those areas. We allowed people to list other areas that we left out. We did leave a lot of other things out. There were other interesting things like Florida aquifer. People talked about birds, shore birds, how it might affect them. And there are questions for sure that have not been even thought about yet. So rank the following educational opportunities that we should target. The number one answer, policymakers. Out of curiosity, do we have any policymakers in the audience? You can kind of just shake your arm if no, not one, maybe one. Okay, again, it would be great to see more policymakers coming to these meetings and learning about some of the work that we're doing and the ways that we're looking at it and what the community is interested in, because it is hard to reach policymakers. And then what type of communication would be helpful? This was kind of a mixed bag, but social media was a big answer. A lot of people wanted to see more social media. A really cool answer that we got on that was on gas station pumps, too. We thought that one was fun. So, how many times are you sitting there pumping your gas and you're watching the little video going by, just going, oh, pump faster, but you'll get some information. So in summary, I'm the last speaker, so I get an extra minute, right? This is the first attempt at this type of survey for NOAA OAP in the cans. We are still sorting the data and trying to figure out how to present it so it will go, to those higher levels. It will be reported and presented to NOAA OAP, and it will be a part of the NOAA OAP. They're going to be doing a nationwide survey for decision-making on prioritizing, monitoring, and assessment, and ultimately as a report to the White House. So with that, thank you. Thank you for listening. There's my email if you guys have any questions or want to contact me. What was that? The survey was made before. Oh,
All right. So we're going to go into question and answer, and those are the kind of questions that we're hoping that you put into Minty. Help us out by making sure that they are, number one, questions, and number two, that they're questions about these presentations so that these presenters can answer them. We're going to go ahead and let you guys start, and just feel free to dive in no particular order. If you see a question you can answer, just speak up, and we'll go as long as we have time.
I guess I have that top one in the corner, so I'll start. I was just getting my microphone on. I'll start with, do I have any plans to share this data analysis on a website that the public can access? Yes, that is part of what we are trying to work on with Eyes on Seagrass. Is managing the data, of course, and then also finding a way to potentially sort of legitimize the data that we're collecting. So we're recognizing that this is a scientific audience for a large part, and we have citizen scientists collecting data. So if we could do a study to sort of demonstrate that that data is up to caliber with what scientists are collecting, that's part of our sort of expansion, is getting all of these different programs to integrate with one another so that we're collecting a base level of data. So typically about the seagrass coverage, the volume, provides a lot of information on the ecosystem services that seagrass is providing. So the short answer is yes, but it's not quite available yet. That being said, we're not trying to gatekeep it. So if you are interested, I could totally share it with you. We're just trying to come up with a network that's easy.
Does anybody else want to grab another one?
I'll take number 2. I think 2 and 3 are both mine. So is there a way to connect with those that spearheaded the Manatee Lands Initiative to replicate in our own county? And I would say yes, in that Trust for Public Land, while I wasn't there at the time, it's my understanding that they came into the county and they did the polls. They have teams that are dedicated to this and experts at it. They know the questions to ask, the economics that are needed. And so if you reach out to me, I can give you some individuals' contact information at the Trust for Public Land. In our county, it was also some of the existing environmental groups that were involved. So Manatee Fish and Game, Conservation Foundation, and probably at least 6 or more that I'm not naming right now. So that's a start.
I'm going to jump back in on a question that was addressed to me, but given the topic of the panel, I think it's a really good question for all of us, and it's that one in the bottom right. What are the ways that you get the word out to new communities to join community science efforts, and are there any strategies that you hope to employ for collaborating with underserved communities? Oh, I get to start. Amazing. Yeah, right now, I think a lot of that is done through networking, or personally. It's, inherently, that networking does have some bias sometimes, based on the fact that, we have a lot of, pretty highly educated people in this room. I recognize that creates biases for underserved communities, but we do hope to make more concentrated efforts as we sort of solidify the program and get connected with some of those communities. I don't know if you guys have active strategies that any of you use to connect with those communities?
Yeah, to add on to that, a couple things. We've gotten great success working with IFAS, with the Sea Grant folks. You guys have helped tremendously. But the other thing we found, especially with doing our survey, is you got to get there. You got to go, you got to meet, and yes, Zoom is helping a little bit, but honestly, face-to-face communication. We do a lot of work with the Gullah Geechee community up in Northeast Florida and Georgia and South Carolina, and it has to be face-to-face. You have to show the appreciation. You have to show hey, not only are you helping us, but we want to help you too. So we want to provide stuff, and it really makes a difference.
I was going to add to that too, since Florida Sea Grant got thrown into the mix there, is that often mode of communication is a really important thing. Particularly in Sea Grant, when we do have these moments, it sounds like today we didn't do an excellent job of recruiting commercial fishermen, but when we do, the pattern is that sometimes they're not great on email. They're out on their boat all day. They don't come home and check their email, so you shoot them a text. Just finding a way that works for them and sort of fits into their existing world.
I would also say that regardless of the group is time. I'll talk from a fishing perspective. I can't tell you how many, at this point, years of time I've spent sitting on docks talking to people. And you don't go there with a purpose. You have to establish relationship and trust before you ever talk about science. I can go, say, for example, we're doing a project in the Bahamas, and I'll go fish with somebody, a fishing guide over there for an entire day, and we just fish. before I ever bring up the thing about a research project we're working on or conservation. You have to develop the personal trust. Just like Emily said, you can't just show up and be project specific. You have to assume that, let's say with Sea Grant, that you're going to interact with people now, 20 years from now, and so you have to develop those relationships that can be applied to different projects. If you go project specific, you're not going to get the valuable feedback that you really need, because it's a one-off, and you'll get some people that'll trust you, but most won't. And so from my perspective, if I want to get information from a fishing guide who's been fishing, say, Charlotte Harbor for 30, 40 years, I have to have a relationship with that person, because sharing information on when and where and how he fishes, that's his business plan. He's not going to share that with anybody. And that's going to be the same with any resource user. You're going to get better quality data if you have a long-term relationship. And so I'm going to step a little bit to the side and just talk about a pet peeve of mine. I detest the term citizen science because it's very top-down. I'm a scientist, you're my citizen doing science. That's not right. You have to develop a relationship, because this stakeholder and science or education interaction is not a one-way street, it's interactive. You will learn as much from them as they will learn from you. They will only learn from you if you actually share the results of the surveys. And overall, resource management agencies share the results of their research maybe 10% of the time. So this goes back to relationship building. You can't build a relationship unless you give as much as you get, and so you have to go in the relationships on a peer-to-peer level, not I'm a scientist and you're my citizen scientist for this project. So I think that's huge, regardless of what field you're in. It's time with those groups.
Yeah, to real quick add to that, the university itself has relationships, but then I have individual relationships and other groups do within it. So it takes a long time. I'm working with one group right now. We're in year 3, and we still really like each other. But that's as far as things have gotten of okay, we're pretty sure we're gonna start doing something at some point. I'm like, good, I'm here when you're ready. And then other groups, it moved a lot faster. So, and the thing to really think about if you're gonna go with marginalized communities, it's an insane amount of trust. It is so much work, and you are going to get rejected repeatedly. But the thing is that you have to keep at it, because we know that's the right thing to do. And if you think about, especially with climate resiliency issues, all of these issues, they disproportionately affect others. It's one of the reasons why we chose to go the K-12 school district route, and I was brought in because everyone has to go to school. It's free public education. They're all there. So then the hard part was, how did you get into a school district? And same kind of problem with a lot of extra laws and rules and stuff. So the relationship building there and showing that we could really actually do something that wasn't an extra. We could actually take something off their plate. Because it was always well, if you're already doing this, let's just, we'll assist with it, as opposed to let me bring something else to make it more difficult. But there is no shortcut. It takes a long time and a lot of effort. And that's also the thing you want to think about in your organization as well when it comes to who's the face of outreach, who's the person making these relationships, what is the procedure for them to continue with that organization, because you need that long-term setup. You need the people. It's really important to make sure that that's set up correctly, or you're going to be restarting these relationships again and again and again. So just remember, it is a long term. There's no magic way to be oh, well, if you go into this group of people and we try these techniques, they always work. No, you're dealing with people, so it's going to be a little bit different. But that relationship is key, and you have to keep at it because it will take a while.
The schools are really an important place to start. And if we're talking about reaching the underserved community, it's really important to reach people where they're at and meet them where they're at, not only figuratively, but literally. So we've had a lot of success reaching out to people in places like local parks and libraries, where they tend to be very accessible, particularly in underserved communities. And it's also just about making yourself accessible when other people need you. So by intentionally being accessible after traditional working hours, or by hosting events that are geared towards people on their lunch break. You really open up yourself up to the working force and additional people, but also just making people stakeholders that don't even realize that they're stakeholders. When we're talking about water, everybody has a bit of skin in the game, right? So just opening up people's eyes and making them understand that this is important to them and helping to connect the water with things that they're already interested in is also really valuable.
I've got a great story that I think wraps this point up, if you will allow me. So when I started in this current position last year, I took over for somebody who had been in the position for 17 years, Betty Stogler, for those of you in the room who know her, who's well established and great at her job. For those who don't know her, I'm very glad that you don't, because there's big shoes to fill there. And I went into a local bait shop. You know, she had had a relationship with the owner her entire 17 years, and I walked in and I said, "Hi, I am the new Betty. I want to continue to have a relationship with you like she did. That's important to me." And I got berated for 30 minutes. He walked around the whole shop. You know, I was sort of like following him like a lost puppy. I didn't really know if I had been dismissed or not. He smoked 2 cigarettes in my face, told me that I looked an awful lot like those eco-idiots that are trying to ruin the country. And after 30 minutes, he looked at me and went, "You didn't fight against everything I said, and you didn't cry. We're good." And since then, he has been the best advocate for me. He has introduced me to so many people as I got started. It was just sort of a wild experience that I feel like probably sums up a lot of moments that we've all had and the work that goes into forming those relationships sometimes.
All right, that was hard to follow, but I've got a couple answers to questions. Yeah, and sometimes people they just want you to listen. That's all. They don't want answers. They want to be listened to. All right. So one was about key pieces that might need restoration. So without habitat value, yes. So for example, right at the Manatee Hillsborough County line, there are two. On the north side, there is an existing conservation land. On the south side, there's a conservation land. In between, pasture, improved pasture. And so, yes, acquisition of that and then restoration is important. So, you know, as I was saying, each property is a little unique. You know, it might have very low scores in one area, but high scores and potential in others. So we have to look at them individually. And, you know, so far we haven't had an opportunity with with willing sellers, you know, being really the limiting factor here that, you know, I could say all other things being held the same, if this park was now in a low socioeconomic area, that would give it yet another advantage. But we do consider all those things and choose within them. And there was one more. Oh, fisheries habitat. So it's interesting that I get this question because when I brought it up at a commission meeting, I actually got a couple snickers, and I was glad that there was a scientist in the room that could speak to it specifically about the millions of dollars that have been brought to parks for fisheries research and improvement. So if it's along a waterway, if it's habitat, you know, shoreline, that not being developed would contribute to fisheries habitat, we say, yes, that's going to protect fisheries habitat by conserving it rather than allowing it to be developed. If there's an opportunity for restoration that would contribute to any of the factors that improve fisheries habitat, then we would consider that as well. So, for instance, even Mixon Fruit Farm, where, you know, the entire farm historically had hydric soils, you know, it contributes to the Braden River and then to the Manatee River. And there are opportunities there to sort of open up a floodplain and create habitat conditions that could essentially, you know, march up as sea levels rise, but also to improve on habitat that will contribute to fisheries offshore for a lot of the reasons that you guys have probably heard throughout the day today.
So guys see my name up there, so let's do a few real quick. Do all teachers and students in Collier County, in Collier districts participate or have the opportunity to? Yeah, they all have the software as of starting in August. Collier County software was all set up last year, so we had a few cohorts go through just to practice with it. Lee County will be set up this year. I'm going around to like every event that's possible, starting in August when everyone gets back from summer break. And I just did the Sizzle and Summer series over at Lee County to be like, did you know you have this new software? So we could at least getting them used to the concept. But this is the busiest time of year, the summer. You're prepping for the rest of the year. So I'm making, in essence, concierge lessons for their curriculum guides of, do you want to try this new thing out? This is specific for your school site, your area, anyone who's willing to do it. But they'll have access to it. And then if there are people that are interested in getting deeper information, it's not on our website yet at FGCU, the Center for Environmental Society, but it will be soon. But they could always contact me directly. And then, so a particular type of spatial environmental data, okay, that we prefer. So for the trainings, I'm working with, if you think about the average, school teacher, they've never seen GIS. I had 2 of them that told me like, oh, I think I've seen that before. I'm like, have you used a Google map? And they're like, oh, okay. So currently, the only thing I'm training them how to do is how to use a Survey 123 to collect point data only right now, because point data was the fastest one to get us started so that they could see how simple it was. We're gonna expand. We actually have a summer camp program right now where we're testing it out with high school students. So we got a third-party company to make this mapping justice program, an environmental justice program for Southwest Florida. And so high school students are testing it out, and we're gonna see how they work with like different polygons and fun stuff. But we're kind of working real slow because we're starting with where everybody is at. But as we get more teachers interested, especially in the more advanced science and math, we definitely want to expand into different areas.
I see a nice easy one up there, so I'll just get it real quick. How can I start the LIFE program and replicate it in my own county? So as I mentioned, the LIFE program was actually set up in partnership with specifically County Up North and Florida DEP. You can definitely replicate it in your own county, but the first step would be to start making that relationship between a county entity and your county schools. For steps after that, feel free to either grab me at the end and we can talk on the side, or email me. My email's in the speaker descriptions, and I can get you set up on further steps after that.
Question about a sunset date in the Manatee County referendum. And no, there was not. The language says that any bonding has to be repaid within 20 years and comply with all laws that pertain to bonding, of course. So there actually wasn't a start date and there wasn't an end date. So I think the idea is that we would bring this back to the community in a couple of years to get their support in continuing. But the limits were really on bonding up to 50 million, and the annual revenue that would be generated based on a 0.15 millage would be roughly 7 million, depending on where the property values are.
I'll grab one, actually I'll combine 2. One is about the planned restoration of yucca pens would be beneficial to snook and tarpon, and another one about redfish population decline in Charlotte Harbor. And I think they're related because they're all about habitat. If you look at the east wall that was presented about earlier with all that benthic macroalgae, a lot of that, so what the east wall used to look like is you had thick turtle grass beds, then there was a gap of open bottom going back into the back country, then there was a strip of shoal grass, haliduli, then there was another gap, and then there was a rupia up in the upper reaches. Redfish, juveniles, small ones, they like that open bottom in between. After Hurricane Charlie came through, there was such massive defoliation of the mangroves, when all those leaves rotted, it created total anoxia for weeks. And it killed all the fish, it also killed all the seagrass. That seagrass had just started to come back 2010, and it was coming back well, and then we started to get more and more of those flashy flows from the watershed of the development in that area to the east. And that seagrass died back. And we started to see, I'd say in 2012, if Dave Blewett's still here, he can remember the year, we started to see filamentous macroalgae all over the prop roots back in those places. So that's when the real nutrient issues started. And I think what we're seeing now is that threshold, the drop off. So Yucca Pens restoration, part of the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative, all that work can have great effects, positive effects for that eastern shoreline. The big qualifier is where that water is sent. So that, if you remember that figure I had up, what is now Yucca Pens Creek, the old watershed, if you look way back many decades ago, was much, much, much smaller than it is now. So when we fix all those areas to the east, which is much needed, when we send it to the west, to the estuary, we have to make sure that those flows are spread out. If you look at old maps, you can see all kinds of creeks that really are no longer there because the water doesn't come, and old sinkholes. You see all those round holes back there? They're old sinkholes where fresh water used to come up as springs, and you can read some of the old accounts. So those were all the places that the fresh water came in. So that's part of Burnt Store Road. I don't know if Kim's here, but Burnt Store Road, there could be a lot of culverts under that. And that links to the redfish as well, because all those waters coming in that could be restored by the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative, including Yucca Pens, will help to restore those types of habitats for the juvenile redfish, which I think is a big problem.
I see one question for me. Is there a way to turn this data into a hands-on educator module for K through 12 and adults? Assuming you're talking about the ocean acidification, like the background on ocean acidification and stuff, we do, if you go to the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program website, they have a whole section on education, and they've put modules out for different grade levels on how to teach it, and in-class activities as well as in the field activities, so in your backyard ponds and stuff. But then also the cans, all of the cans have been working on those as well, so each can has one specific to the region. I'm not sure actually if GCAN has put one out yet, but we have stuff on our SOCAN website, and MACAN, which is the Mid-Atlantic can, has one very specific to like Chesapeake Bay and that kind of work, but they can all be adapted to your region. And a lot of times we'll go to things like Teacher on the Estuary programs and teach those to K through 12 teachers that can take them back to their students and their classes as well.
I'll touch on the one in the center, and then I guess I'll pass it around because it sounds like it could be answered by everybody up here. But the question says, for the panel, children are the future and engaging them is great, but action is needed by adults soon. What is the best way to reach them and engage them? So I want to add to the thought that reaching children is because children are the future. The additional reason to reach out to youth is because what the children learn, they bring home. So if you want to reach the parents, a great way to do that is to educate the children, because they'll come home, and especially if they're excited, they're going to share what they learned. If you give them something like a magnet that reinforces what they learned, they're going to take that home and be proud of it and hang it up, and then their parents are also going to see that every day. And as far as engaging adults specifically, I can talk for Sarasota County, where we have a high prevalence of homeowners associations, particularly in our newer portions of development. That's where I make the most impact, is going to homeowners associations and talking to not only residents, but also board members who can make the decisions at a community level. And I'd like to pass that around.
Oh, yeah. So one cool thing about this is, dinner table conversation is the thing a K-12 teacher dreams of. Every time a kid came back and was like, my mom asked me what I did today, and then I told them. It was like amazing. We talked about it. I was like, oh my gosh. When I get a random message from a parent pickup, they're like, did you tell them about blah, blah? I don't know why they were talking about it. So it spreads fast. And if you think about the way, one of the reasons my directive specifically is to go for K-12 and formal and informal educators is because usually the hub of your community is your school. The majority of people in that community have to go there or visit there. Someone stops there. You get health services there, especially in Title I schools. So much is done through the school that it is a great way to spread as much communication as possible, and it does go past the students. But also talking about the adults. One of the things that we talk about with adult learning theory and how to make these programs more relevant, because my counterpart who would normally do the adult group never got hired, so I kind of randomly will do some of those programs and activities, is that they have to be highly involved in the structure of it. So it comes back down to that relationship building. Find a group. Yes, homeowners associations are actually great. They all have retention ponds and things. They're the perfect ones to be like, why is this a problem? Why does it smell? Like, oh, we can help you out with that. But they have to kind of want to be involved. That kind of is that first level of engagement, is that they kind of reach out. So one of the things we have is blanket emails they can send to us of like, hey, water school, what about this? And we find someone to work with them about it, or we come up with like a program that they can do. But yeah, once again, relationship building, being really open to it. But yeah, almost everyone stops at the school at some point.
And then also, I just wanted to touch back on what I said earlier about making everybody a stakeholder. A lot of people don't realize that whether or not they pick up their grass clippings can have a downstream effect on things that they like to do at the beach. So just making those connections and helping people to realize that actions they may or may not be doing may be contributing to their overall quality of life is really important.
I see one about I mentioned 3 properties that weren't supported by commission for further work on acquisition. And while I cannot speak for any of them, I can mention the characteristics. For instance, one of the properties was great in that it was right next to one of our existing preserves, so it was connected, would make it larger, but it wasn't a huge property. I'm gonna say just maybe 30 acres. It had some good habitat, had some more opportunity for restoration. It was rare in that it's, there's not much coastal upland left that you can restore. It was a small amount of that. But there also was a 4-story home on the property that had beautiful views over Tampa Bay from the Skyway practically, like to Mexico. And so a large portion of the cost of that property would be also acquiring that home. And while, I would be happy to have my offices be located on the top floor, maybe the taxpayers didn't have that in mind. And, we look for partners. We mentioned a couple people, maybe CCA or, an organization like yours would be interested in, working with us and using that as, their home office or something like that. And none of those opportunities worked out. So we let that one go. Maybe in the future, a conservation easement would be appropriate there. That property also only had opportunity for, say, maybe 3 more homes, and don't quote me because I haven't gone through all the land use analysis that has to be done for that. But for example, we're not talking about, building 100 homes on that site, maybe just 3 more because there was an easement that restricted it. So there really are a lot of things that we look at and consider and getting the most out of our money, because it'd be wonderful to buy all the properties that make sense. But, as you can imagine, $50 million in, today's market goes very fast. So.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the presenters, and also thank you to all the attendees who have stuck it out to the end of the day.